All right, Anita Allen's Forgetting Yourself. This is an interesting text. It should be fairly straightforward to read, but there is kind of a lot going on here, so let's see if we can work out what Allen is trying to argue in this piece. I take her overall point to be something like, in addition to knowing ourselves, we can also forget ourselves, and this is important to concerns about our awareness of group membership and concerns about identity as it is constituted through universal and group norms. So, to forget yourself is to temporarily abandon the manners or morals that sustain both social approval and self-esteem, stemming from a lack of awareness or a lack of control, usually due to emotion. Self-deception, on the other hand, involves both believing and disbelieving the same propositions at the same time, whereas forgetting yourself entails both remembering and not remembering your own identity at the same time. According to Allen, if the self is strongly integrated, capable of critical, truth-oriented reflection with its various functions in principle accessible to and corrigible by one another, then forgetting the self would be impossible. So forgetting the self has ties with akrasia, or weakness of the will, which occurs when a person violates a morally binding behavioral norm. So forgetting yourself involves breaching what you know to be a behavioral requirement. This is ultimately important to Allen because she's arguing that achieving a colorblind society might in fact be impossible, although it seems to be desired by many. A colorblind society would require a literal and continuous forgetting of oneself, putting race out of everyone's minds. Yet, the self is governed by rule-like norms that are internalized in the processes of socialization. This should bring up the kind of socialization and teaching that Lugones was referring to when she discussed the logics of purity and logics of impurity. These rule-like norms are rules that we are disposed to conform to, not only in our beliefs, but also in our emotions and our actions and our habits. Given the internalization of social norms and behaviors, forgetting oneself can be seen as failing to do what we're generally motivated to do, according to socially instilled prescriptions concerning our behavior. Even the self-conscious can forget themselves. And when we forget ourselves, we still know who we are, but we do breach a given rule or standard or behavioral norm which we've been socialized to follow. We are social creatures, and social relationships and values are constitutive of the self. This is one of the themes of the course that should be coming out more and more strongly as we get towards the end of the syllabus. So we do have a choice about conformity to communal norms, yet in most instances we choose to go along. So you might think again about Butler's Performativity Theory from the first section of the course. That is, on Butler's view, performing gender or gender acts are acts that already exist prior to our performing them. So we do have a kind of agency in the ways in which we perform our gender, yet our gender is social in such a way that it's not completely individual or personal. And Allen's text here should help us to understand how it is that the social constitutes the actions, habits, beliefs, and behaviors of individual persons in a given society. We're self-regulating beings, and the very same good behavior that wins social approval from others also earns us self-esteem. So we're motivated in particular ways to regulate our actions and behaviors and beliefs through socially inscribed norms, yet still we can, in certain moments, forget ourselves in relation to those norms. Allen claims that people forget themselves either because they're inattentive at a given moment, like Pam, the humming CEO, or because they're excited by emotions such as jealousy, lust, anger, fear, like the raging teacher. So, inattention might lead to an inconsequential instance of forgetting oneself, like humming during a meeting. And this is an asocial moment. That is, it's embarrassing. It might be slightly uncomfortable because there's a kind of slipping away from the constraining norms governing a given communal realm. And it may be appropriate in this kind of instance for a friend to nudge us back to social awareness, as on Alan's view, they have certain duties and permissions that go beyond polite evasion, but it might be rude, she says, for a stranger to do so. Forgetting oneself is an act of nonconformity, but it's not an intentional act of rebellion or critique. So it's not something like MLK Jr.'s civil disobedience that you read about in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It's not an intentional act of rebellion, though it is a failure to conform. And this failure to conform, she says, can sometimes be a good thing. Though in the case of the humming CEO, it's not an instance of rebellion. It might have beneficial consequences, like alerting others to the fact that this meeting's kind of dragging along, it might be time to wrap things up. Similarly, she explains that in a society where women are not supposed to talk back to men, a woman may forget herself unintentionally, yet her misbehavior might have beneficial consequences. That is, insiders and outsiders may see it as favorable. It may bring to light some problem with the social norm at play. In the case of unbridled emotion, failure to conform to a given norm might result in a more consequential instance of forgetting oneself. So, for example, the case of the angry teacher, forgetting herself in a breach of role-related responsibility as she commits injury to a student and damages her reputation and possibly her self-esteem. In the Jim Crow era, blacks who forgot themselves in this way risked being jailed or lynched, and Ellen gives the example of Sophie from the novel The Color Purple. So a racist society can construct the same action, depending on the race of the actor, as either a forgetting of oneself or as a heinous crime. We might be able to add this to McIntosh's list of white privilege, right? So whites have the privilege of forgetting oneself without serious harm or consequence. Forgetting oneself also has an internal conception that has to be considered. As social beings, our personal identities are intimately linked with our communities of origin and influence. So we internalize the social norms of the given society, community, and set of groups within which we are socialized. So when one conceives of oneself as having forgotten oneself, it is these internalized norms that serve as the basis for having forgotten oneself. And this is important because an internal conception of forgetting oneself is not merely to deviate from a given social norm, but to deviate from an internalized social norm. So, for example, the humming CEO has internalized the norm, do not hum during meetings, because you'll appear uninterested. But had she not internalized this social norm, her humming during the meeting would not have been an instance of forgetting herself, forgetting oneself, even if others may think she has forgotten herself. And learning how to behave oneself and not to forget oneself, that is, to be a disciplined self, is part of our childhood education. Again, this is a very important point that has sort of been woven through the readings throughout the course of the semester. The disciplining of bodies and persons and how that disciplining affects one's subjectivity, one's autonomy, who one is, one's identity. And so the imperative, don't forget yourself, simply means do what you're supposed to do. Do what society says you ought to do. Behave. Yet we might ask, how this can be problematic, particularly in societies that have social norms that are themselves problematic, harmful, and oppressive. So Alan explains how forgetting yourself functions as a kind of metaphor. Since we realize people have not literally forgotten themselves, they don't have amnesia, their memories of social compliance have simply slipped away momentarily. They have deviated from their ordinary patterns of behavior, which include obeying social rules. So people can forget themselves and violate rules they think are silly, or people can forget themselves and violate rules they think are sound. And whether an instance of forgetting oneself results in regret or shame depends on how significant one takes the breach to be. That is, whether or not they believe the rule to be a good one. So, to be an instance of forgetting oneself, it has to be a social rule or norm that has been internalized, whether one believes that rule to be silly or to be sound. In addition to metaphor, forgetting oneself functions as a euphemism, since it's a polite way of saying that someone has done something wrong. A kind person has been unkind if they've forgotten themselves. A sophisticated person has become unsophisticated or vulgar if they have forgotten themselves. So forgetting oneself or forgetting yourself is a brief and infrequent deviation from normal everyday practice and habit and action that's in accordance with one's internalized social norms. It's a temporary lapse. It's not a persistent habit or pattern of behavior. This would be bad character. So if the angry teacher breaches rules of decorum repeatedly, it's not a forgetting of oneself, it's a change in character. Forgetting oneself can result not only in embarrassment or shame, but it can be morally culpable behavior. The teacher example illustrates this. When the angry teacher forgets herself, it's wrong. Even though we may see this example as forgivable, and we can understand the circumstances that might lead this to happen, her action is wrong because we hold others morally responsible for bad conduct. Forgetting oneself can result in morally culpable behavior in which the consequences can either be trivial or serious, but not too serious. So, for example, if a person's immoral behavior includes serious physical or emotional injury to another person, for example, a violent murder, the expression of forgetting oneself no longer applies. Violently murdering someone doesn't happen as a result of a momentary forgetting of oneself. Yet forgetting oneself can serve as a reason to excuse or forgive rare or inappropriate conduct. As Alan says, just like every dog is entitled to one bite, every human being is entitled to an occasional social breach. People who forget themselves are not ill-mannered or immoral. Alan wants to take this concept of forgetting oneself or forgetting yourself and think about this concept in relation to the phenomena of race and racial identity. Literal forgetting is a cognitive disassociation that occurs all the time. I don't know about you, but as I age, it occurs more and more and more. Most individual acts and events that occur in our lives are forgotten. Yet, forgetting race is an unusual occurrence, at least in societies like the United States. And Alan argues that even those African Americans who escape racial self-consciousness, that is, an awareness of belonging to a supposedly inferior group. Recall the experiment with the black children and the black and white dolls. So racial self-consciousness is the awareness of belonging to a supposedly inferior group, which causes feelings of shame and inferiority. And even persons who escape racial self-consciousness are still prone to a kind of race consciousness. That is, the tendency to select one's race as a subject matter of thought, but without the feelings of personal inferiority. So African Americans dwell on race because their dwelling place is a society with a history of legally and illegally enforced racial discrimination and residual racism. Race is at the forefront of Black thought, whether or not it is a topic of conversation. Race consciousness is a fact of life for African Americans. Not everyone has a racialized identity, but most Americans do. And I assume by Americans she means persons from the United States here. So we use racial categories for choosing friends, for choosing intimate partners, in hiring practices, for establishing social boundaries, for establishing behavioral norms, for census taking, for citizenship status, and for social status. Race just is an element of personal identity over the course of our lives. Again, as we saw with Macintosh, race is integral to our social, moral, and epistemological lives. Whether we are white and enjoying white privilege, whether we're non-white and suffering the consequences of white privilege and racism. So racial self-consciousness is a pathology, this feeling of inferiority due to race, but race consciousness is not a pathology. In fact, some would argue that the absence of race consciousness is a pathology. That is, it's a failure to acquire an appropriate identity to flourish in our current society. The question that Ellen is getting at, that she wants to ask here, is whether or not forgetting one's race can constitute an instance of forgetting yourself. And she gives us the example of the Black university student who's having a conversation with her white friend planning a party, who momentarily forgets that she's Black. And much like the humming CEO, the Black student who forgot herself is brought back to remember herself again due to a friend's sort of nudging. So in the case of the Black student forgetting she's Black, this is an important forgetting, not because it shows the possibility of a colorblind society, but because there's an expectation in Black communities that Blacks will not act white. Not only are there social norms that are universal across the bounds of a society, there are also community and group norms. And large communities generate complex behavioral norms that can be either universal across the community or group specific within the community. So universal norms apply to everyone, whereas group specific norms may apply only to women or to a given race or religion or religious minority, etc. And they commonly privilege some groups while subordinating others. But it's important to understand that some universal and group-specific norms are fundamental to structuring social relationships. And people seldom neglect such norms that associate identity with social relationships, whether or not they accept them as valid norms. So, for example, Sophia in The Color Purple, who is sent to jail for forgetting herself when speaking to a white person. Universal and group-specific norms are fundamental to structuring our beliefs, the ways in which we act, the ways in which we relate to others, whether or not those norms are accepted as valid. So the costs of not attending to fundamental structural norms are high, especially for Blacks in this society, which is why women and people of color tend to be aware, even hyper-aware, of group-specific norms. The costs of attending to non-fundamental group-specific norms is generally trivial. For example, she gives the example of a woman spitting on the sidewalk. Whereas more fundamental breaches of gender-specific behavior or race-specific behavior can be considered exceedingly risky. You can look at any hate crime to see how this is the case. So both groups and subgroups impose norms of behavior. For example, Black women were once expected to not only work in the fields with black men, but also assume caretaking roles for orphan children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews that black men were not expected to assume. Similarly, black women ought not have sex with white men. So there are certain norms of behavior that are intragroup specific. Inattention and emotion can lead one to forget oneself, and there are many norms that can be unfollowed this way, though well-internalized norms will be somewhat resistant to breach. So norms that are heavily internalized are not often breached. Now, we're not born with a race, but we're born with race as a feature of our social world. And this influences us so greatly that we rarely fail to escape the pull of constitutive norms. Race-related noncompliance is rare in a society shaped by a history of colonialism, slavery, segregation, and prejudice. So being inattentive to group-based norms is barely conceivable for many, especially for people of color in societies like the United States. Communication between blacks and whites is governed by specific rules of engagement, and if one is black, one is aware of such rules and is highly unlikely to break those rules, even in an instance of forgetting oneself. Forgetting oneself bears a relationship to concerns about group alienation and racial identity. Despite the legal promotion of colorblindness, the United States is highly segregated. Blacks and other racial minorities, as well as whites, are motivated to attend to their race. So moving to an ideal colorblind society is not strategically viable since racial self-consciousness, and especially race consciousness, are deeply embedded in our behavior and our values. They are constitutive of our very identities, whether we're black or white. So blacks adhere to race-specific norms internal to their communities to sustain self-esteem, and race-specific norms external to their communities to avoid conflicts with members of other groups. Race-specific values and behaviors, along with racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, are powerful barriers to meaningful racial integration in the United States. And many of the public policies that we debate relate to matters of defining ourselves in opposition to and in light of group values. For example, women's rights, gay rights, trans rights, welfare, rights for the disabled, racial justice, religious freedoms, political expressions. And as Alan says, it seems that everyone wants to be themselves, but no one wants to be without some group basis for sustaining identity and moral self-esteem. So there's something important about our groups and communities and how they constitute and sustain our identities, our behaviors, our beliefs, our habits, even our emotions. So the questions here that come out of Alan's account are questions like, how do social norms, social practices, social values, including but not limited to racial norms, practices, and values, shape or constitute selves? What particular aspects of identity are shaped by the social world? To what degree are their selves separate from social norms, practices, and values? That is, how do social norms, practices, and values shape who you are?